Welcome, everyone. If everybody could put their name and organization into the chat box, I would appreciate that. Okay, a few more people are still joining here. Hello, everyone. We can go ahead and get started now. There will be more people joining us as we go, I'm sure. I'll just keep admitting people. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this technical assistance for the UW Self-Sufficiency Calculator. We're going to have presenters from Seeking LWDB today, as well as the University of Washington. We are doing this meeting to give you a quick background on the methodology behind the calculator, to review how the calculator is used with a participant to establish and track goals, explore the data that can be pulled out and the potential value to organizations, programs, and participants. And then at the end, we're going to have time for questions and answers. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to the UW team.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm just going to share my screen here and make sure everyone can see it. Everyone see that?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, hi everyone, thank you for having me here today. My name is Annie Kuklik. I am a researcher with the Self-Sufficiency Standard project at the University of Washington School of Social Work. Before we dive into talking more about the technical aspects of how to utilize the calculator itself, we wanted to provide a brief introduction on what the standard is, the methodology around it, and how it's used. So I'm going to give you about a 10-minute spiel on that before we dive into what Shalane has to teach on you all. So we have been producing this data at the Self-Sufficiency Standard project since 1996, and we've been producing it for Washington State specifically since 2001. So we have about 20 years of data now for the state of Washington. At its core, the Self-Sufficiency Standard is a budget-based living wage measure that defines the real cost of living for working families at a minimally adequate level. The standard was originally developed to address the shortcomings of the official poverty measure, which, as we all know, is just far too low and does not offer any variation by geographic location or family composition. The standard was originally calculated by our founder, Dr. Diana Pierce, when she was the director at the Women and Poverty Project at Wider Opportunities for Women. It was originally giving some seed funding from the Ford Foundation and was designed as a performance measure for the goal of self-sufficiency in federal job training programs. The ultimate task was really to create a measure that was realistic and detailed on what clients and families actually needed to be self-sufficient or to get by at a minimally adequate level. Since it began in 1996, we have calculated the standard for 41 states and have recently started receiving funding from the company IKEA, the furniture company, to create regular updates for the 27 states in which it has stores, Washington being one of those stores. So what is the standards approach? The standard takes a market basket approach to measure the cost of each basic need that are faced by working families. And what this means is, unlike the federal official poverty measure, the standard actually includes all of the costs of major budget items. So we look at housing costs, we look at childcare costs, healthcare costs, transportation costs, taxes and tax credits, miscellaneous costs, in addition to food costs. The standard accounts for geographic variation in costs, which is very important, as we know, because the cost of housing varies pretty dramatically by your location, even within a state. The standard varies by the age groups of children, by infants, preschoolers, school-age kids, and teenagers. We have the 4 age categories, which is essentially to ensure that we are reflecting true costs of childcare, which vary by the age of the child. And the standard reflects modern family practices. It is assuming that all parents are working full-time, and thus all employment-related costs are included. Overall, the standard defines a realistic measurement of the income requirements for over 700 different family types, and it's across each county in a given state. That all being said, the standard is, as you can see here on the slide, a minimally adequate measure. So it defines the amount of income necessary to meet basic needs, but it doesn't include any public assistance. It doesn't include private or informal assistance, like free babysitting by a relative or friend, food. There's no eating out that's included in the standard. It's all food that's prepared at home. It doesn't include like shared housing or anything like that. It's very bare bones, and it's really just meant to reflect the minimum of what a family needs to get by. So on this slide, you'll see 2 donuts. The one on the left represents, or at least the one on my left represents the official poverty measure and the costs that go into creating that number versus the standard for a family of 2 adults, 1 infant and 1 preschooler living in Yakima County. And you'll see the multiple colors which indicate the various components of the self-sufficiency standard. So actually measuring the cost of each budget item shows that food is only 13% of a family's budget in the standard, not the 33% as assumed in the official poverty measure on the left. In Yakima, housing and childcare make up 51% of this family's budget, which is very typical for families with young children across the country, for them to be spending almost half of their income on just the cost of housing and childcare. So when we calculate the standard, we try to find the best available data that is updated on a regular basis and is credible. I'm going to run through briefly how we calculate and find each component of the self-sufficiency standard cost. So you'll see here in the 2 columns of the table, you'll have the single adult costs, and then the single adult if they have a preschooler and a school-aged child added on. We calculate the cost of housing based on the fair market rents that are calculated annually by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. These fair market rents include utilities. They do not include telephone and cable costs, though. And they reflect the cost of housing that meets basic standards of decency. Generally, they're set around the 40th percentile, meaning that 40% of housing in a given area is less expensive than the FMRs. We assume that adults and children do not share bedrooms, with 2 adults maximum per room and 2 children maximum per bedroom. For the cost of childcare, we include the expense of full-time care for infants and preschoolers and part-time before and after school care for school-aged children. We calculate the cost of childcare from the state market rate survey that's released about every 2 years, and that's defined at the 75th percentile. As you'll note, this childcare cost does not include any extracurricular activities or babysitting while not at work. Food costs, we assume the cost of nutritious food prepared at home based on the USDA low-cost food plan. This doesn't allow for any takeout or restaurant meals or coffee. And for a single adult, it works out to about $9 a day on average in Washington State, which is very little. The food costs are varied by county using Feeding America's Map the Meal Gap data based on some scans of grocery receipts. We have two means of calculating transportation. We utilize the cost of public transportation if 7% or more of workers in a given county utilize public transportation to get to and from work. So for families in King County, we do assume that they are buying an Orca Pass to get to and from work and to get to and from childcare and to get to and from the store. And then for private transportation costs, we assume the expense of owning and operating a car. Healthcare costs assume the expenses of employer-sponsored health insurance. Premiums and out-of-pocket costs are based on the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey. And we calculate an index by county based on the benchmark plan in the state marketplace. We have miscellaneous costs that are calculated by taking 10% of all other costs. They include clothing, shoes, paper products, diapers, cleaning products, household items, etc. And then we also calculate taxes and tax credits. We include federal income tax, payroll taxes, state and local taxes where applicable. We include tax credits as well. And so those include the federal earned income tax credit, the child independent care tax credit, and the child tax credit. And then at the bottom, finally, you'll see that we also have an emergency savings calculation, which is the amount needed to cover living expenses when there's job loss net of the amount expected to be received in unemployment benefits. And the amount calculated takes into account the average tenure on a job and the average length of unemployment. So this next slide depicts, again, the variation by county within Washington State from our 2020 report that we produced in partnership with WDC, and we released last year. So if anyone is interested in accessing this data or seeing any of these figures and analysis that goes with it, you are welcome to get on our website, selfsufficiencystandard.org/Washington, and it'll pop up with both the data and these this report. But this map really indicates the variation for an adult and preschooler. Costs range from $16 per hour in Lincoln County all the way up to $37.59 in King County. So with that all being said, I'm going to pass it off to Shalane Aldrich, who will present more on the calculator itself. I'm going to be around after to answer any questions. We're also lucky enough to have Lisa Manzer, the director of the Self-Sufficiency Standard project, on the line as well. So she will be around to answer any questions as well. So thanks a lot. I'm passing it over to you, Shalane.
Thank you. So Annie gave a really great description of the Self-Sufficiency Standard and how that is pulled together. And one thing that's very interesting is that when you look at the official poverty measure and then you compare it to the Self-Sufficiency Standard, the standard is often higher. Not surprising because we do know that the cost of living is higher than that federal poverty measure. So it's much more accurate. So in Washington State, the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County adopted the standard as our official measure of self-sufficiency. And we currently use the standard with the self-sufficiency calculator tool as a counseling tool and a program evaluation benchmark. So in 2007, the WDC launched the calculator with support from local workforce councils across the state, along with funding from Paul Allen Family Foundation and the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. So what the calculator does is it pulls together the information for the self-sufficiency standard, and it uses that as the benchmark. It uses 700 different family types, so depending on the information that you put in there, you will get different data for what that minimum wage is to be. Next slide. So here's one way that we have measured the self-sufficiency standard in progress across programs. So at the Seattle King County WDC, we use it with all our WIOA contractors to measure the participants' progress by using the self-sufficiency wage data at entry and at exit. So this is something that's embedded in all Title I contractors' contracts and something that they have to enter for each person enrolled in the program. So with the creation of the self-sufficiency calculator tool, we created a database. And this allows the case managers with login rights to save their customer information. And then when they are at the point of exit, they go back into that customer's record, update the wage and any other pertinent information, and then save it and exit it. And then that allows us to pull the data. So this shows you at program entry for program year 19, 59% of those who were enrolled in the WIOA programs had zero income. So 50% had a self-sufficiency wage of 24% of them had 50% of the self-sufficiency standard. So, for example, if they were supposed to make $50 an hour to cover all of their very basic expenses, 24% of those participants were only making half of that. And then you look at the program exit data on the right-hand side, and you'll see that at program exit, 49% had reached the self-sufficiency wage or higher. And then if you look at the 16%, those customers had reached 71% of the standard. So you can see that overall, everybody has increased, although not everybody is reaching that wage at 100% of the exits, but you see progress along that continuum. Next slide. So the other thing to note is that within our database, the calculator tool, all the information that is plugged in is able to be pulled out. There are some reporting functions, and this is what it looks like when I am in there in the administrator login. And the reports that we can pull are the earned income compared to the self-sufficiency ratio, less than 100% at self-sufficiency at registration. So you take a look at what they're learning or what they are earning and then compare it to the self-sufficiency wage. And then we can look at those who enrolled with 0% income at registration. And then you can also take a look at anything less than 100% of the self-sufficiency at registration. So you can see it from a couple of different views. You can also take a look at some demographics which are aligned with the census data demographics. So we ask age, limited demographics in terms of race and ethnicity, but we do have some of that there. And we also ask language proficiency. And one of the limitations here in terms of our reporting functions is there have been a lot of advancements in reporting since the inception of the calculator in 2007. So while all the data is going in, we don't have sophisticated methods to put that into fancy visual reports within this platform. However, our performance director, Brian Pennell, has actually done quite a bit in terms of pulling that out, downloading the raw data, and then from there putting it into some other reports or platforms to analyze the data. Brian is on the line today, and so if there are more questions on that piece of it, he's available to answer those at the end of the training. Next slide. So finally, one of the most important uses of the calculator, in my opinion, is to be able to help job seekers plan long-term career goals and to see how different jobs and their corresponding wages will impact them personally. So when you are living in poverty, when you are making a low wage, and you're looking for advancement, there may be a perception that a $17 an hour job, since it may be a $5 an hour increase, will be enough to be able to cover everything that you need to in terms of your everyday expenses. However, depending on the customer's family type, the composition, the number of children, the ages, that can really vary. And so, as Annie described, this provides that benchmark of if you are moving forward and your ultimate goal is no public assistance, no subsidized housing, no other supports in that nature, then this is the wage that you need to be at. This is what it will take. And so at times, seeing that number can be it can create some sticker shock with customers. However, at the same time, it can also be used quickly to determine if a certain career goal is not quite the right long-term career goal. And it can also be used with the customers using their own personalized budget information as well. So you can see what the standard is, and then you can see the customer's unique situation that they're dealing with as well for their actual costs. And it's really valuable as a counseling tool. And we can also email the reports to customers and provide copies and show different scenarios as well. So if somebody is looking to enter a training program, let's say, and they are trying to figure out if they want to go to be a medical assistant or if they would like to be a phlebotomist, you can look at the different wages, the different lengths of time that the person will be in those pathways, and then make some determinations from there. Last part of this presentation, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jessie Martin. And Jessie worked with us as one of our subcontractors on our Healthcare Professions Opportunity Grant as a case manager. He has now since come on to the WDC to work with us, but I'd really like him to share some of his perspective in terms of how he used the calculator with customers, what it was like on the day-to-day, what's good about it, what's not. So I'm going to pass that on to him. And Annie, you can go ahead and stop showing the screen here. And Jessie, if you want to take over, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Shalane. I'm going to try to share my screen and okay. You should be seeing the first page of the self-sufficiency calculator in which you will log into as a case manager. Is everybody seeing this?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So this is really where you can input the basic demographics of the clients that you're working with. And so you'll see the name, registration date, gender, household ages. This is going to automatically generate the household number for total people in the household. You can put your county in. This will help to generate the numbers for the expectation for wages and other numbers at the final report. And then you'll have your ability to put in the benefits that this individual might be receiving as well. The second page is going to be kind of the estimated numbers off of that initial demographics. So you'll see the estimated housing for a family of 3 in Spokane County is roughly $910. Childcare food costs, transportation costs, etc. And then you'll see down here, just like the discussion was earlier about the tax credits and stuff. The next page, you're going to be seeing the expenses, and this is going to be something that you will be able to get from the participants at that time. There's a couple ways you can do this. You can go ahead and get this information directly from the participant while you are with them. One of the ways that we did it was we used a budget sheet that we had the clients fill out beforehand, so that we can really get a good idea of what their budget was and what their expenses were, without really trying to get that information directly from them as we're walking through this. It also allows us to really, walk through, financial responsibility as we are filling this out, and then ultimately at the final report, kind of look at what the overall expectations are and what they're going to need to be financially self-sufficient at that point. So for this client, I put in, basic food stamps for a family of 3, estimated TANF. I just put in a TANF number, just assuming that family of 3 maybe isn't working, they are receiving TANF, they are receiving food stamps, just to get a good number. Expenses, this is where you're going to be putting in the expenses from whether you're doing this through individually with the client or via their budget form. And I just kind of put in some basic numbers. $15 for childcare. I'm just estimating what coverage is for an individual on TANF and receiving BFED services. Typically, the copay is about a $15 copay for those individuals. The miscellaneous is where you will be kind of incorporating all the other stuff that's kind of the catch-all that isn't individually captured within transportation, food, healthcare, different costs like that. So it could be, laundry cost, or maybe eating out cost, or different, phone and other costs that aren't directly impacted by those. Once again, you're going through a review with the client, making sure everything is accurate prior to moving to their final report. And then when you move on to the final report, well, I should also mention too, one thing you can always do is explore work supports with the client. And this kind of helps you walk through different financial assistance that they may be eligible for, and kind of talk about different options that may be helpful to get them closer to their self-sufficiency standard, or help them while they're working on that goal. The final report is kind of looks like this, and for a lot of clients, it can be very intimidating when they see their self-sufficiency standard wage of $4,100, and they're only making a total income of $1,500. So this is really where we have an opportunity to provide some talking points, some education around financial responsibility. And if a client is spending $300 a month on clothes, have that discussion about, is that necessary? Can we, reduce that to, pay a little bit more for different things, or save that money? At the bottom here, we look at the surplus or shortfall. For this client specifically, they had a $269 shortfall. Ultimately, we either want this to be, zeroed out, or the best situation would be a surplus for the client, that they're actually earning more than their self-sufficiency wage. And then you have the tax credits that was discussed earlier as well. Like I said, I mean, this can be really intimidating for clients as they see what they should be making versus what they are making. This is very doable, I think, in most situations. But like we talked about earlier within King County, where a self-sufficiency wage might be $34 an hour, and that's per adult, that can be really, really quite intimidating for a client who is maybe only making $15 an hour. So that's when we really, kind of use that tool as a talking point and education piece, like Shalane was saying, to identify what jobs might be the best fit for each individual client. And we can really kind of walk through what that wage might look like, in the future, and how we can, support them in making that and getting to that ultimate goal of theirs. So that's kind of, a good look at kind of everything within the calculator. The last piece I'll take a look at is Shalane kind of mentioned, the different things you can do once you've created this report. Like she said, you can email a link to the client. You can test a different wage and work supports within this final report. And at the very end, once you've saved this and you're updating a client, you won't have the option to go back in. So it's good to kind of get all the information you can for the client, and you can kind of walk through the process with them to, see what they can do to get to that point and meet their self-sufficiency wage.
Thanks, Jesse. The last thing I'll add, to just expand a little bit on what he showed, there's 3 things to look at. There is the customer's existing situation, what they're earning, the subsidies, everything that they're receiving. And then when it shows that income adequacy, if you recall, he had a bit of a deficit there. The income adequacy is just saying, from what you put in with your earnings and your expenses, are you currently earning enough to get by and pay all of your expenses that you've listed out? So someone can be income adequate while receiving TANF, while receiving subsidies, etc. And then when you look at the self-sufficiency standard, you can then see the differences between what they're earning and the various subsidies they may be receiving compared to what would be required if they were receiving no subsidies. So I wanted to pause there. I know that you all have gotten lots of information. I wanted to first open up the floor to see if anybody had any questions about the self-sufficiency standard, how it's developed, etc. Any of those questions for the University of Washington team?
I have a question. It might be outside of that category, but just about when you created the database, like what does that process look like so that you have that back-end functionality for administrators to be able to pull those reports? And then when you, as a administrator on the back end, what do you use that information? How do you use that to inform your program development across programs?
So I will do 2 things here. I'm going to do a screen share to show you what that actually looks like. And then I'm going to punt it over to Brian Pannell with our organization to talk a little bit about some of the reports he has pulled, where how he's manipulated the data, and also how we take a look at it performance-wise. Just briefly, overall, we always look at every year where people come in at wage-wise and then where they exit at. So we look at the gains that people have made in terms of their income increasing. So that's one thing we always look at. Let me see here. There's Brian. All right, and let me do a screen share.
Good afternoon, everybody. There are a variety of reports that are built into the calculator that you can use. Some are a little more specific than others. The one that we typically use the most are those first two that you'll see there, the less than 100% self-sufficiency at registration, and then the at 0% piece there. Those actually give us some pretty good pictures of what you'll see in terms of where people are when they walk in the door, plus where they are once they exit. So these are going to be just some high level numbers that you can kind of see on the screen. You'll basically get some, roll up numbers of what those look like in terms of the percentages of self-sufficiency that the folks are meeting, and a lot of times it's really helpful to get a little bit more into detail. Now, to do that, when you have folks who have the admin access, if you scroll down to that download button or link, you can actually download the client data for your area. This is really helpful because what you can do is you can take this and it's going to come through as a CSV file, which you can put into Excel and manipulate from there. But what we've done locally is actually we've taken that and then we're putting it into a SQL Server structure so that we can write specific queries against that and look at what some of that client level data might be. So a lot of it really depends on what kind of capability you have in your area around that. So you can use anything. You can use Excel to do some basic sorting and filtering to get to some of those things. You can also use Microsoft Access to form a database out of it, and it's going to give you just tons and tons of data. But there's a lot of columns, so be prepared for that.
So Brian, I actually have this up on the screen what that downloaded data looks like. I just, I hid certain columns to protect privacy or any names, but this is kind of what it looks like, a big data dump, as Brian was saying.
Yeah, and then you can utilize that to develop queries and reports against the data. So you can actually kind of look at it at a much more granular level so that you can get down into things like demographics and there's so many factors in here that you can either take individually or you can overlay factors too to get to a more complex picture of everything. You could actually probably spend a good day just walking through some of the possibilities of looking at some of this data. I highly recommend working with the downloaded data because you can get to a much more rich picture than just some of the basic reports that you'll see in the calculator. Any questions on that?
I see Jeff Allen has his hand up. So. Go ahead, Jeff.
Sure, thank you. I had kind of two related questions. One around the methodology. Was there any consideration made for the needs of youth and new adults? So that when you're thinking about self-sufficiency, that might be different for a youth or new adult. So I was wondering if in the design and methodologies that there was consideration for that age group. And also if anyone has had experience, you talk about the use of this tool and how intimidating it can be and the conversations that come from that. If any experience in working with youth and new adults in that conversation and using the tool and examining the data with them.
Lisa, would you like to answer that first question?
Yeah, as far as the calculation of the self-sufficiency standard, any calculations don't change for the adults. So we have a single adult number. So the same costs for like childcare and the market rate is the same whether you are 19 and have a child or 32 or 35. Same with rent. There may be different resources available to you as a young adult, which is different on the for working with them on the case manager side. But on the cost side of the calculation, it's the same.
And I can kind of talk to the question about how to, discuss it with a youth or new adult. I think this is the opportunity that you have to really, get some information from that individual about where they want to go and what their career ambitions are, so that you can help to educate that individual in what's going to make sense, what's going to allow them to reach their self-sufficiency standard versus other options that they might have looked at in the past. So this is really a good opportunity to use the calculator as an education piece to try to figure out what their self-sufficiency standard is and where they want it to be, and what they're going to need to make to get to their standard.
And this is Beth Blanchard. I'm
Oh,
director of
Beth, we can't hear you very well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my microphone. There we go. I wanted to add about the intimidation piece. I understand it is intimidating. The cost of living where we all live is something that we need to know, and it should be used in order to help people plan a pathway. So it's really important information, even though it may be shocking. It's real. And so that's part of the reason why we've decided that we want to use this to make sure people understand what their living wage would be, what a goal for a wage would be. And sometimes it's going to take some time before you get there. But if you don't have that goal, and if you're not aware of the real cost of living, it's like understanding why people are struggling so much for so long in poverty, because they're not making enough money to actually support their families. So it's kind of like a bottom line that helps people plan and think along a career pathway in a longer term as well.
Yeah, and one thing I would say in terms of the use, I see a question in the chat as well, very, very relevant to the prior one. So I had managed a group of case managers in various programs where they used the calculator on a regular basis. And part of using it effectively for many case managers was printing it out ahead of time or getting that budget information, so that they then went through the calculator, kind of saw what that landscape was, and then were prepared when the client came in for the discussion around career goals, options, etc. Because then they could have a few things prepared, understand what types of jobs and career pathways led to the wages that they needed to in order to reach their self-sufficiency standard. And also, as a team, one thing that we did was we really worked on messaging and how to message, how to infuse hope into all of the messaging with customers, and to make sure that they had the information, choices, and resources to move forward, and that it wasn't a person's failure if they couldn't meet that. For some customers, they were very surprised and then enlightened to say, oh, well, if that's the minimum, no wonder I'm struggling. I thought I was just doing a terrible job with money management. It's like, no, this is actually where it's at. And there's a big deficit here in this region as cost of living increase. And so on the flip side too, one of the reasons I think it's so valuable to capture all of this information on wages is because when we are working with industry partners and trying to talk to them about why they have so many vacancies, it comes down to wages and quality jobs and being able to offer those pathways. And so I think there's a lot that we could do as a state with advocacy. And I know that the UW has experienced that with some of the other states they've worked with who've used it for policy change and to really advocate for better wages and conditions and things like that.
Are there any more?
Thank you very much for your responses.
I know there's also been some questions just around the use of the calculator being a bit of a burden to case managers or direct service. And so I just wanted to ask Jesse, in terms of when you were using it with customers and inputting the information, how much time did that process take just to input and save information for a customer?
Yeah, it really doesn't take a long time to input the information. The majority of the time is really having that discussion with the client in, like you said, easing their fears and easing that intimidation that may come from seeing the final numbers from the report. But also, it's having that discussion too with the client about that the final numbers doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to be the numbers you're looking at. So if it says you're going to be paying $600 for childcare, that gives you an opportunity to really discuss the fact that, that might not be the situation if you have, other assistance that you can count on too. So, but honestly, the time that it takes to go through the calculator and inputting information for a specific client really, takes a matter of, maybe 5 minutes or less.
Jesse, this is Emily Hansen. I was just wondering, comparatively, adding that to all the other tasks of maybe intaking, and then, I understand the calculator on its own isn't very time consuming possibly, but there's other areas where we do collect that data from specifically enrolled clients in programs. So just curious, as moving forward, and just again, maybe that concern about more on the case managers, because the ETO system, we already collect that data if somebody's enrolled in our program. So just curious about asking people to do it multiple times. Not that I don't think it's valuable, but just a little concern in that area, because there is part of this that is directly related to working with the client, which is nice. But just looking at it from that lens, what would you say?
Well, that's completely understandable. I haven't had to use ETO, so this was our our opportunity to use the calculator as an education piece and to gather information to really walk clients through their their processing through their careers and really trying to assess what to do and what's going to make sense for them. So I don't know if Shalane or Beth can talk to the other aspects, but since I haven't had to do ETO, and this was really our key measure for having that discussion with the clients and where we were capturing the data.
Okay, thank you so much.
One thing that I would say is I don't think it's as extensive as what ETO entry is. It's essentially a budgeting tool. And I wanted to just show this sheet because someone asked about it earlier, what our budget sheet looked like. So this is a PDF fillable, but this is what folks would use with customers, because what it does is it it aligns with the calculator. And so even if you're not using the calculator to save the client data, but you're coming in and using this sheet as a counseling tool for budgeting, that's a great way to do it as well. I just think, I'm a big believer in realistic numbers, and that if we're trying to help our customers get jobs, having a realistic baseline of what it takes to meet expenses is only going to help them in terms of having all the tools and information that they need.
Thank you so much.
Are there any more? I have a question, and I'll be honest, I'm a little worried about it being a demotivator sometimes. I'm in a rural area where if someone's self-sufficiency calculator says they need to earn $35 an hour, and they have, oh, I don't know, a disability, a felony background, lack English skills, it is so far away to reach that as a potential that I'm concerned about it just demotivating people on their progress rather than motivating. What have you guys run into with that, and how have you dealt with that?
I think that's a valid concern. It's definitely something that you run into, and I think for a lot of people, it's trying to have that discussion with them, that just because this says you're going to have to earn $24 an hour to be self-sufficient, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a house that's going to cost $1,200 to pay a month. There's other options, and having that discussion with what the expenses on the final report show. Having that discussion about these are the numbers that the calculator is looking at, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you need to have in order to be self-sufficient for yourself. Like I said, childcare doesn't have to be $600 a month. You can find other means of childcare potentially. Transportation doesn't necessarily have to be, so much a month. So having that discussion with where you can cut some costs in order for you to still maintain a self-sufficiency wage at whatever you're making, and or at least getting closer to it.
I think the other aspect too is, at least in my prior program, we were working homeless employment program, and we didn't require that every counselor sat down with the printouts and said, all right, it's time to share some news with you. You're making $30 less an hour than you actually need to. I mean, that is not how things played out. For us as a system, it was very good for us to be able to see where people started and where they ended in terms of progress. For example, in that particular time with the homeless employment program, we had the city of Seattle stating what their expectations were for someone to come in homeless, get a job, and then be stably housed all within a 6-month period. And some of that data was really good for us to be able to go back and say, this actually is not a realistic expectation that you're having, because the length of service is X amount, and then at this juncture they get housing, then which leads to employment, typically not at that high wage because of various factors. And so that was good for us on a programmatic standpoint to be able to plan, advocate, and have those conversations with funders. The other thing is, case managers just picked and choose. Here's where you would like to get your gold standard. How can we get you further along the pathway? What is your goal to earn more money, and what are some ways that we can do that? And what I think is really important with your with your direct service staff and your team is to make sure that they are feeling really equipped to be able to integrate some type of financial education in with the career counseling, because it's vital in order to help people move ahead in terms of poverty. You know, and if they're not feeling comfortable talking about finances and getting ahead in all of the budgetary pieces, they're probably not going to dive deep into the conversation, whether you require everybody to use the calculator or not. You're always going to have that spectrum of people that really embrace it and those that don't. But as we look forward, if I was to create a very robust self-sufficiency calculator system, I think really talking about financial education and how to use these tools like the calculator effectively in those counseling sessions is really important. And that's where I would go next if I was, you know, as I said, making this more robust than it is right now.
And just the other thing, Beth Blanchard again, is the idea that the people understand what their wage goal is, and that they understand that and you know, when you talk with people about this, a lot of them have, you know, friends helping, they're sharing things, they're sharing housing. They've been doing all of that for a long time, and they need to continue to do it, you know, for some time. But people are generally pretty creative about how they can exist in the world and not make the wage that you know, the goal that would make them self-sufficient. But I just think it's of vital importance that we share it and that people know it, and that it is, you know, can be a goal for people to say, to support my family now as it is now, as the kids are little, et cetera. You know, we need to earn this amount of money, or we need to increase our wages. I need to get a better job. And that's part of our job, is to help people understand how to make those moves, where to go to make those moves. So that's what I think WIOA is about.
Is there any more lingering questions out there? Okay, well, I just like to thank the Seeking team and the UW team for putting on this great training today. And if you have any questions, you can send them to me and I can get them circulated. And it is being recorded. I'll share the recording after, so you can share that more broadly. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.